I'm particularly delighted to introduce our guest this evening, who's a very close friend and a dear colleague. In fact, he was my boss for 9 years at NYU, Michael Gilsenan, who I'm sure needs no introduction, but deserves a very long one. He of course, is one of the most distinguished scholars of the Middle East, the sociology of the Middle East. But in 1960 or thereabouts, I think he was in danger, if that's the word. Perhaps that's too negative. He almost became a student of English literature. I think he accepted a position or a place at Oxford University, at Pembroke College, Oxford, to read English, but then took a year off. In those days, you took a year off before going up to Oxford or Cambridge, and worked as a volunteer in the VSO, the voluntary service overseas, which is like the Peace Corps, and worked in the Hadhrami, I believe, where he met the great Freddie Beeston, one of the most charismatic figures in the time that he was at Oxford, the great professor, the Laudian professor of Arabic, who persuaded Michael, having got to know him very well, to drop English and do Arabic studies at Oxford instead. And so he did a BA in Arabic, in Oriental Studies, as it's still known, rather old-fashionedly, but nevertheless. But it was a bit too textual for Michael, I think. And he was more interested in the sociology and practice of religion rather than just the textual study of religion. So he did his PhD in anthropology and sociology and studied with the great Evans Pritchard at Oxford, and did his fieldwork as an anthropologist in Cairo between 1963 and 64. And the result of that work came out in a monograph entitled Sufi and Sayyid, an essay in the practice of religion. And soon after that, he began teaching, as a lecturer at the University College London. He also, in the 70s, well, he changed his site of study and researched a small community, Akkad, actually, in northern Lebanon. And he, in particular, studied narratives of violence and domination, and the result of that very long field trip was a book that was published in 96, which also, well, Michael's reputation was established long before 96, but nevertheless, the book on Akkad was published in 96, entitled Lords of the Lebanese Marches, a study of narrative and violence in a Lebanese society. His reputation was really established by his book, Recognizing Islam, which is written and cast for a very broad readership on the sociology and practice of religion, which has appeared in many editions. But since Lord of the Lebanese Marches, he's moved the site of his fieldwork back, in a way, to the Yemen. So he returned to his roots, as it were, and spent 3 years, but has spent the last 10 years at least studying the Yemeni diaspora, the Hadhrami diaspora in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, and Singapore in particular, is where he's focused his work, and he's going to talk about that today. It's going to be a real treat for us. I know Michael is a great raconteur, and it's a real privilege to hear him lecture. He's also a very brave lecturer tonight. He's not feeling too well. Anyone more faint-hearted would have pulled out of this, but he's soldiering through, so we're grateful for that too. Let me just say, he holds a number of titles. He was a reader at UCL, then he went to the Ivory Tower, really, in its most classic form. He held a named chair, the Khalid bin Abdullah Saud Chair in the Sociology of the Contemporary Arab World at Magdalen College, Oxford, which is one of the wonders of the world, really. Magdalen College, Oxford. He was dragged away from there by NYU, lured away, whatever the word is in academia, to come out of the Ivory Tower and build a department. And he built, starting in 1995, one of the great PhD departments in Middle Eastern and Islamic studies in the States and perhaps in the Western world. It produces some of the finest young scholars in the history and general study of the Middle East and Islam, and it's all down to Mike's great vision. So please welcome Michael Gilsenan to the podium.
As Philip said, my interest began in the Arab world initially in Hadramaut, and 40 years later, such are the works of fate and one's own, oh my goodness. am I right? Fate and one's own strange shifts on the seas that I find myself, or I make myself, voyage in Southeast Asia also. And today I want to talk about just two aspects of this new project of mine on the Hadhrami in Southeast Asia, and of course what is somebody of Arab descent in Singapore, in Indonesia, in Perak, in Penang, in Kalimantan, and so on, is a very shifting thing. And Indonesian friends may say, well, you have to say we are of Arab descent. And other people say, well, we had to suppress being Arab, quote unquote, during the Sukarno and Suharto period until 1980s. So there are all sorts of notions of Arabness and Arab identity, which I will just glance at in this talk, and perhaps we can discuss them in greater detail. So I'll begin with a general sketch, and then just mention the particular focus at the moment is on inheritance. And the passing on of goods and the transmission of goods, but I mean goods in the widest sense, moral, ethical, symbolic, cultural, as well as material, over in a diaspora, because as I'm sure many people in this room know, how do you, across the times and the spaces, transmit or fail to transmit the different resources and that which is precious and vital to the idea of family, not least in the very changing historical and colonial context in which the Hadhrami, as with everybody else, find themselves. Abu Dhabi is a wonderful place, of course, to evoke migrations and trade routes and movements of populations and city-states, which of course I'll be talking about Singapore. So I hope this will spark some sense of difference and comparison. So let me just begin very briefly with a few reminders, as it were. Here is 1914. It's the kind of map which in some ways, very fortunately, we have forgotten. But on the other hand, it's very important for my story and ours. And as you know, Aden, from 1839, was part of the seagoing empire that Britain established against the French, the Dutch, and so on. So that Aden was linked to Ceylon, Trincomalee, and Colombo, of course. Singapore, which isn't even on this map, interestingly enough, but which lies, as you know, at the bottom of the Malacca Straits, and which is founded as a British colony in 1819, 1823 by Stamford Raffles, so just before Aden. So there's this whole world of Indian Ocean imperial connections, trading, including, of course, the Germans, and one sees now with some, perhaps almost astonishment, all these brackets, FR, French, the Dutch East Indies, and so on. This is the wider context of 1914, that crucial year, the beginning of the First World War, which was to end, amongst other things, with the end of the Ottoman Empire. So this was the part of the spatial, political, economic context in which the Hadramis moved, and of course they come from this area here in what was later, much later, to become the East Aden Protectorate under the British, and then again as part of what is now Southeast Yemen. So Arabs, and we can have the second one, thank you. There we are. Yeah. This is the British bases of 1898. I just do that so that you have at the back of your minds the kind of broader frame in which we operate. Thanks. And here is Southeast, what since the Second World War we call Southeast Asia, but which in English was often called Farther India, F-A-R-T-H-E-R, until the Second World War period. And it's throughout this region, and up into Mindanao and so on, that different Hadhrami groupings, persons, and families moved Some from very, very early on, many centuries ago, but my particular interest is in the period from around the 1860s on, because it's from the 1860s on, the 1870s, that the larger scale movement of Hadhrami from Muqallar and Sheher and Shibam and Se'un and Tarim and many other places in the Wadi move in greater numbers. They've already moved into India. There are all sorts of links in Hyderabad, Deccan, in Gujarat, the Malabar coast, the Coromandel coast. So you can write an Indian Ocean history using the movement of Hadramis. But my particular interest is in the later movement into Malaysia, what is now Malaysia, Singapore and Indonesia. And they moved, of course, from town to town, island to island. Main chance, opportunism, a father's instruction, a brother's capital, all sorts of motivations shifted them around. And of course, they married from different populations, linguistically, socially, culturally, and so on. And that notion that to be authentically Hadhrami, of Hadhrami origin or of Arab origin in Southeast Asia, as a friend of mine said, is you're mixed. So the authentic position is to be mixed. And we can come to that. One of the obvious things that you will know is that many of the Hadhrami population claim to be sayyid, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. Others were mashayikh. Others were qaba'il of tribal origin and so on. Those categorizations played out sometimes from the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s in considerable conflicts, debates, arguments, textual, documentary, and other as to what exactly the position and privileges or not privileges of the sayyids were, the theological, legal differences, what the implications were for changes in Islamic education, for example. And those struggles were often fought out in this area. A great deal of debate and dispute occurred in this region between the Sada, or elements of the Sada, and elements of the Arab members of the Hadhrami communities in that later period. And it's important, of course, not to say that all the Sayyids were over here and all the Qabail and so on. That didn't work, but it was certainly a major story. A friend of mine in Singapore introducing me to his family said, well, all our family look Indian. And then he sort of went around the room, and he also showed me a photograph of the previous generation. And that's a very classical encounter that I've had all over Southeast Asia. The people say, well, of course you can see one occasion that stays with me, when the auntie says of her little nephew, who she summoned specially, because she's insisted on meeting me to talk about Arab identity. And she comes from Banda in the east, and she brings in her nephew, who's clearly gone through this before, and she goes through his 11 bloods. She uses the idiom of blood. And she identifies by his nose, his hair, his skin color, his height, his eyes, and so on, his bloods. And she catalogs them while he stands very patiently, probably dying to get out and play football. But she's clearly telling me something about what it is to be mixed. And one of the other languages of identity of Arabs in Southeast Asia is spoken through food. Because the language of cuisine and the blendings that my mother, my grandmother brought together this and brought together that, because the grandmothers were very often Sundanese, Maduris, Javanese, Chinese, and so on. And one of the wives of the millionaire I'm going to speak about later was herself, in fact, a Chinese lady. That notion of language and mixing, very often that it's the mother who passes on this culture. It was my grandmother who taught us manners. It was my grandmother who cared for us and trained us. She loved me so much, she beat me. That sort of, she ran the big house, and we'll see an example of this. So one of the interesting things that happens in Southeast Asia is that all the significant aspects of the maternal actually finds its way out into very explicit discussions about patrilineal, matrilineal in a much more mixed, what we sometimes call bilateral kind of way. So this was very unusual for me coming from where I did with the studies I had made before. It's important that there's no single niche for people of Arab descent in Southeast Asia. They were sailors, peddlers, traders of every kind, cloth merchants, spice dealers, preachers, animal export people, and sometimes all of the above. They stayed, they moved, they married in different places and sometimes didn't bother to marry in different places. So there are families get discovered. This is another trope. It wasn't until my father died that we found out that we had brothers and sisters in, Kalimantan or Sulawesi or something of that kind, which you can imagine what that does for inheritance. It was also the case that some of the sayyids in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century married the daughters of what became called rajas, that's to say Malay rulers on the coasts of Sumatra and Java, and that marriage between the raja, whose daughter has the honor of marrying the sayyid. There is this balance between the ruler, or the person who would love to be a ruler. His enemies call him a pirate, a thug, a murderer, or an enlightened person if they're his supporters. But the relationship between particular sayyids and the local politics of statelets is something to be remembered. And that continued in the previous king of Malaysia. You probably know there's a circulating kingship every 7 years, I think it is, was of the Sayyid Jamal Alayal family. So there are individual places. The Arabs feature in all the stories. They're all over the towns of Palembang, Aceh, Medan, Lampung, all along the coast of Java. So they were identified as coastal people in some key ways. And one of the things that happened is that the language of identity, family, descent, and so on, we are Al-Junaid, we are Tamimi, we are Alcaff, we are a Sagaf, is given. But then somebody will say to you, well, we're Al-Attas. But actually, I'm not really, because I grew up with my mother's side of the family. And so really, I'm much more of a Sagaf. And then he may produce some version of what the Sagafs are, in distinction from the Al-Attasis and what that may or may not mean. And one of the things that really took me aback after my experience in South Arabia and other places is that bridegrooms not uncommonly moved in with the girl's family after marriage. So after marriages, it was quite common, friends of mine in Singapore would say, oh yes, well I lived with my wife's family for 7 or 8 years, 9, 10 years. And when you get visiting delegations of Saudi ulama, for example, who come to, and they're invited, of course, as honored guests to weddings, they get very shocked and surprised because they see a lot of the ritual they don't recognize at all, which people say, well, that's, they say, but this is not Islamic. And so the local reply is always, oh, no, it's not religion at all, it's merely custom. So that use of custom to separate out other elements that may or may not get defined as really Malay or Chinese or Indian, which includes the foods, the dress, some of the language, and so on, is part of this world of mixing that I mentioned briefly earlier. And that's, of course, happened in terms of language as well. One of the obvious things is that Hadhramis played very different social, political, and economic roles, and many, of course, ceased to have any kind of even a notion of a Hadhrami link or a Hadhrami origin. But if you look at the histories of different nationalist groupings and different Islamic groupings in the region, one of the sets of names that occur and recur in terms of political, anti-imperialist or pro, in fact, movements are different kinds of Hadhrami families, one of whom I'll speak about today. There's a lot of interesting debate, of course, in Singapore, in Malaysia, not so much in Singapore, in fact, in Malaysia, and particularly in Java and Sumatra, as to whether the Arabs brought Islam. The assumption has often been written into the studies that it was the Arabs, which could mean a large number of things, but very often meant the Hadhramis, who brought Islam, but that has been much argued over the last 20 years from two angles. One is different scholars saying, well, actually, we should look at in the broad sense of the word Indian, we should look at Indian scholars in Mecca and even Cairo, but certainly in Mecca. And we should look at those links coming into Southeast Asia, remembering, of course, that terms like Indian have no national or nationalist significance in those days. The other is Chinese. There are in Java the so-called famous 9 saints, the Wali Songo. And one of the debates that goes on is around the shrines of holy men all over Java. I would meet young men, for example, who would claim to have spent the last 10 years of their lives going to every single shrine of what they would call Arab saints in Java and planning to go to Kalimantan and other places. So the idea of the shrine, the idea of association with the dead, the cult of the dead, but the dead who possess living powers, itself, of course, contested by people who oppose that notion, is related to certain Javanese conceptions about death and sacrifice and food and offerings and so on in a very complex way. But one of the interesting questions was what was the relationship between the early Chinese Muslims, and one of the things that has been suggested and is currently being argued over is that some of these early shrines are not of Arab origin so much as they are of Chinese. There's a famous shrine in Jakarta, and one of the things that I love about this particular shrine is it's, and this is familiar in many other places, it's visited equally by Chinese merchants, workers, peddlers, businessmen, and so on, as it is by Muslims in general. And it's the shrine of Lora Batang, and it contains 2 holy tombs. And one of them is of Sayyid Hussein al-Attas, who was a famous sayyid about whom much is written, and the other is one Abdul Qadir, and Abdul Qadir is his friend and his sadiq, and he's a Chinese convert, and the saint says in his writings, whoever does not make a ziyarah to the tomb of Abdul Qadir, his ziyarah to my tomb is ghair maqbool. It's not acceptable. So these questions of relations in which the tomb relation is only one is a very interesting and complicated one. Could we just have the next? So let me turn now to be a little bit more specific about Singapore and shift the focus. Why Singapore? Well, Singapore was a kind, and still is, a kind of, you have to remember where it was on the map, but many of you probably visited in any case. It became a sort of one of the pivotal points of not just the British imperial movement and so on, but of the Hadhrami presence. And one of the crucial things about Singapore was not just that it was this fundamental, deeply significant port through which everything flows down the Straits of Malacca, in from the very different economic system of the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies, who had all sorts of restrictive and tariff practices. But it was also a place in which, as I'll show a few things in a moment, just starting here, this is a sketch of the first setting of the city. It's a place in which landed property and real estate became absolutely crucial to the fortunes of many Hadhrami over generations. So that, for example, in Hadramaut today, as in wherever else it may be, in the Gulf and elsewhere where people are receiving remittances from the rents of a house bought by a grandfather, a great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather in some cases, 3/27ths, 4/19ths, you know, the complicated fractionings, and they are receiving those rents from landed property in Singapore. And that landed property, the Arabs became in Singapore itself, not only particularly attached to trade, but they were identified with investment from a very early period in real estate. And the interesting thing about Singapore, in contrast to many other areas, is the British didn't really care very much about land. Singapore was not about land, Singapore was about sea. Singapore was about shipping and connections and networks. The British were not concerned to clear Singapore and settle it and have surveys and establish a stranglehold, etc., etc. And the growth of Singapore was extremely ad hoc, and it depended on Indian and Arab capital much more than it did on British. And we'll come to this in a moment. So the family I'm going to talk about, the Alcaff, and when I say family, there are enormous numbers of persons, of course, who bear the name Alcaff in different branches and so on and so forth. But I'm going to use that very loosely for the moment. The Alcaff family established themselves in Singapore from India, probably already with capital. Many stories, of course, are that the great-grandfather or whoever it is arrives. He arrives alone. He has nothing. And one night, the Dutch governor or someone walks down the street and he sees this young Arab and there's a light shining around his head. So you get miraculous stories about the great migrant who is sort of recognized by the Dutch or the British or whatever. Anyway, the Alcaffs go from India, probably with money, probably 3 brothers, one of whom Muhammad is spoken of as the leader of all this, in the 1850s, 1860s, something like that. The empire is moving into its later phase of glory and worldwide extent, so to speak. Bureaucracy is increasing, military force is increasing. Technology is transforming transport to Southeast Asia. And part of all this is the Alcaffs. And sorry, just to say that when Raffles this is Stanford Raffles, when he sets up Singapore, he has a racial division of space in his mind. This is where the Malays will be, this is where the Arabs will be, this is where the Chinese will be. It's a racialized space. And where the Europeans will be, John Little & Co., Raffles Place, Collier Quay, we're going to see a little bit of it. Here's the Singapore River. So this is the commercial and governmental heart of Singapore. And here is the Chinatown on the west side. And down here is the Arab and Malay town. And all these houses here are the foundation of Arab fortunes in Singapore. So yeah, thank you. And this is a picture of the Alcaff building, the famous arcade building. And the arcade is the building on the left here. It's what's called Indo-Saracenic. That's the Hong Kong-Shanghai Bank. And this whole area is on the river. It's the new banks, the new insurance, and the Alcaff offices, Alcaff & Co. Trading Company. So it's a major intervention into the space of Singapore. And on the other side of it is the European and other social center of the city, which is Raffles Place. And here is Raffles Place, and thanks. And you walk through a passage from down the side of the arcade, and the passage is called Change Alley. Now, there are change alleys in many places in the world. That's where every conceivable possible currency could be changed in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of procedures. So the Alcaffs, I like the idea of the Alcaffs on Change Alley, because one of the things I think about when I'm looking at some of this research is precisely that persons in diasporas become changers. They become translators. They are themselves translated. They're moved from one state of being, one cultural space to another. And so the words like change, translation, and so on, are the words that play quite a part in my thinking. They're also, of course, transactions. So that it is all these trans words that play a part in the self-identification of Arab families in Southeast Asia. And I could add just one final term. We could say Change Alley is a space of conversion. Not a religious conversion, but financial, economic, cultural, and perhaps even political conversion. Labor and capital, monetary forms. So it's integral to the meaning of translation. It's interesting that local agents of these translations are often identified in racial, quote-unquote, terms. Thus, there are sort of types that people use. They say, oh yes, well, the Indian money changer. Do you remember so-and-so? Yes, all the money changers we dealt with were Indian. Yeah. Then they would say, but of course our comprador, who worked in the bank for us, was Chinese. Mr. So-and-so, I remember him. He was the person you had to go to. Because as I'm sure you know from a trading, the key thing is identifying the persons who make the switches and who make the negotiations and who make articulations or joins between the different levels and the different kinds of processes with a sort of virtuosity. And that these were the people who were voting. So it was the Chinese comprador, the Indian money changer, the Indian law clerk. Because as the Arabs move into Singapore, so the legal apparatuses of the British Empire are beginning very slowly in a very contradictory, messy, muddled kind of way to change and develop also. And as you move into real estate, gradually you move into the world of the English solicitor, the conveyancing act, the root of title, and you have to go through an English court in some way or another. So that becomes important to the Alcaffs themselves. And I think they became, and they're in many of the travel books written by British and other writers, of course, part of what Joseph Conrad, the novelist, called the Arab network all over the islands. So there they are in this key meeting and dispersal point of Singapore. They have interest in Surabaya. Under Dutch law, they set up the Alcaff Company in Surabaya. They have interest in Kalimantan. They have interest in Pekalongan, in all sorts of different places and so on. But particularly they have interests in Singapore. So 1909, that building marks not the beginning, of course, but the moment of public proclamation, so to speak, of the real weight and significance in imperial space of the Alcaff family. Sheikh Alcaff is the only survivor by this time, and he creates 6 trusts or settlements under English law. And I say under English law because the English forbade the establishment of family Alcaff. You could not establish a waqf for family. You could only establish an English trust, which for various complicated reasons comes to an end after about 80 years. And at that point, the original capital has to be dispersed. It has to be shared out. And Sheikh, between 1888 and 1906, establishes these famous trusts. And a lot of Muslim capital in Singapore and Malaysia was and is held under English law. So it's quite common to find inheritance crises and conflicts and disputes in the English courts, including asking the English courts to decide about what the correct Muslim division of shares would be. So it's absolutely characteristic, and not at all, it sounds wildly paradoxical. But in fact, it isn't as paradoxical as it sounds. For English courts still, independent Singapore courts, still to this day, rule on the real Muslim law that should be applied in this or that or the other contexts. And in those kinds of contexts, Mufti's rulings, or Mufti's opinions, I should say, the fatwa, are only accepted in an English court if the Mufti is there to be cross-examined as a material witness. So his actual fatwa does not carry legal force. And in fact, a judge 4 years ago said rather sternly that the Mufti of Egypt, when he'd sent a fatwa in support of one side of a family struggle, I think in 2006, he'd sent this fatwa, and the family, one part of the family tried to introduce the fatwa into the discussion, and the judge said, you can't introduce it into the discussion. First of all, he said, it's very short, which is a fascinating statement. You think, what is the significance of that statement? The Mufti of Egypt sends a fatwa, and the judge in Singapore says, well, it's very short. I think what it means is that a judge in the common law procedures expects a narrative of all the elements in the case. A fatwa is a completely different genre of document, of course, an authority. The mufti is then, so A, it's too short. B, it looks more of a ruling than an opinion. And of course, the mufti is not, according to the judge, entitled to give rulings at all. And third, he's not present to be examined. So I think from a very early period, one of the things that happens in Singapore is you get a mixture of legal codes, actually. People talk about Muslim law, they talk about English law, straight settlements law, but in fact, what often happens is extremely difficult to sort out one from the other. Now, I'm just going to go through, very quickly through the 5 minutes, or, yeah. Yes? Okay. Some of the other photographic imagery of the Alcaffs, if good. Just to stress again that the Alcaff building was literally just behind and connected to Raffles Square, which was the social center of the colonial world. And thanks. Moving on to a very different picture, a rather deliberately, a slightly cheap shock, I'm afraid, I confess. This is Hokkien Street. And Hokkien Street, if you remember, I said that up at the top left hand of that first map of Singapore, Chinatown. A large number of the houses in Chinatown were owned by Arab, Indian, and later Chinese. Chinese capital wasn't really in real estate. It was much more in trade and business. But it was on these kinds of, basically, they were tenements with 40, 50, 60 people in them. If you could, can we go back to that very first map by any chance? Not the very first, the Singapore in, no, the next one, sorry. Just to remind you. Here, this is a map done by a social historian in, I think, the 70s. Here is the entry to the Singapore River, as I mentioned. Here is Collier Quay, where the Alcaff building, the arcade, was. And here is Raffles Square, behind. Here is Chinatown. And here, on this area here, what he's marked are the rickshaw tenements. That's to say, tenement buildings where the rickshaw pullers, who were essential to the working of Singapore, lived. He's also marked Chinese and Japanese brothels in different areas, as you could see. Well, you can't see very well, but... So what was happening, I think, in Singapore was that of course, cheek by jowl, side by side, with John Little's department store and the Alcaff building, was that the workforce of Singapore, which was around the port, it was essential that you had a large population of what were called coolies from southern and southeastern China, most of whom did not settle until the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s or so. And the housing, the habitat for the working population was not being created by the British. The British never made significant investments and hardly had any significant investments to make, in fact, in the urban fabric of Singapore. So the building of Singapore and the housing in these tenement conditions, in Hokkien Street and the others, was done partly by the Arabs. So the rents were not rents on large buildings. They were rents on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these tenements that were crucial to the British having living quarters for the working population. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, just very quickly, and then we can move on. No, we can move on to the next one. That's fine. So that's Hokkien Street. And I've got plenty of files at home in which properties in Hokkien Street are part of the 1888 trust of the Alcaffs, of the 1906 trust. There are cases going on in 1998, for example, of one house in Dunlop Street that cost 1,500 Singapore dollars in 1935, Sheikh Tamimi, one of the famous Tamimi tribe, and in 1998 was worth 500,000 Singapore dollars, because Dunlop Street had now become part of the new Little India, so to speak, which was being disputed by the 8 brothers and 2 sisters, the Chinese rent collector, another Arab family, allegations of fraud, and so on. So the properties have their histories that go on over many decades. We can switch, thank you. Now, the Alcaffs, in this whole period into the 20s and 30s, middle, late 20s and 30s, were a very important part of empire in the sense that they established they did not play major institutional roles in the sense of being members of legislative councils or anything of that kind. If you look at the records, you don't find them in official Singapore records. But what you do find, if you're fortunate enough to have extremely kind and helpful friends of the family, are pictures like this, which show what the social work of the Alcaffs was. It was intensely social and political work, networking, translating, as I say. This is the Alcaff mansion. At the top of the hill is the Alcaff mansion. Here are the 400, 450 guests, the cream of Singapore society, mostly in their Eurasian, Malay, Indian, Chinese sections, British officials, and so on. The Marine Band, you can't see them, is playing off for their pleasure and amusement. And they're having formal teas. And as you know, one of the key things about all systems, but certainly about the imperial one, was the nature of the public social occasion, particularly when, for example, a new governor, a new police commissioner, the minister's visiting, and I don't need to tell anybody here that the key page in any newspaper was the page of arrivals and departures. Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so are leaving for leave but returning on so-and-so. The minister of so-and-so, the sultan of such and such is here. So these arrivals and departures and networks of persons came together in not so much in formal settings, well, this is sort of in between, but in this kind of setting, which is indeed formal, but not in the, say, in the Legco or something of that kind. And this, and we can carry on with that. Here is, you can see the 2 flags. I don't know whether we can get that into better focus. And you have here the person who was described to me. He was an adopted person from Mecca, perhaps Cherkess, perhaps Turkish. These are the words that were thrown. But he was adopted, and he became, in the words of my friend Alwi Alcaff, our spokesman. He was a good public speaker. So he was the one in charge. But here and here are the sayyids wearing, of the Alcaff family, wearing, of course, their full sayyid dress. And here is a figure that, if you can only see him in close up, is such a caricature of a British governor. It's almost something to be disbelieved. Again. So these were stagings, performances of that very important part of colonial rule, which is called friendship. They were great friends with Mr. X, Mr. Y. Did you know X? The idiom of relations of influence, power, translation, and so on, very often passes through across the Indian Ocean, and you went to the marriages back in Britain, you exchanged gifts. So these were exchange networks with persons who were your friends. And the staging of friends was such an occasion as this. Next, please, thank you. Whoops. Sorry, can we have the one after that? And then we'll go back to this lady. But one of the other things that I want to there we go. One of the other things I want to stress is that the role of women, both in family, in descent, in making marriages, in being, as I have suggested, the key cultural brokers and translators, but also in the elite. I'm speaking of the elite. Women like Sharifa Alwiya Abu Bakr al-Junaid was an extremely important woman, not least because she was on the very few marriages between the al-Junaid family, an extremely significant trading and merchant family, as parts of them are still in Singapore and elsewhere, of course, and the Alcaffs. And she had independent property. The discussion of property and women is absolutely integral in a way that I hadn't had experience of in my other different kinds of encounters in the Arab world. So in Singapore, when people were talking family, kinship, descent, relations, culture, marriage, food, dress, frequently I began to realize it was through some named matriarchal figure. And then her three daughters, she, for example, and then we could have Sharifa Alawi, this very striking formal studio portrait. Of course, the portraits of the tea parties were formal occasions. Large albums were made and distributed to each of the 450 guests. Sharifa Alawi, with that extremely striking expression, she was, so to speak, a power in her own right. And using the figure of Sharifa Alawi, people now speak in trying to tell me what it was like in the 30s and 40s. They say, well, and she had the house. It's that very familiar pattern that the men are not in the house. If you talk about the Alcaff mansion, you never talk about, say, Muhammad Alcaff. You never talk about, say, Ahmad Alcaff. You talk about the matriarch. And the house is identified with the woman. And the house is also a very public place. It's a prestigious address. It's part of her property. Her will is extremely significant. Her children in what relation to the children of the other wives of her husband, and so on. So I began to realize that not only in symbolic and cultural terms, but in material terms of property, law, the distribution of resources, the makings of marriages, figures like this were absolutely crucial to me, and they were persons of public position. And they lived an extraordinarily high-end kind of public life and private life. And when the formal dinners were held in the Al-Saghaf mansions or in the Alcaff mansions, they were presided over by persons such as Sharifa Alawiya. And that notion of the home, the big house, for the elite families who have now often lost that position, who have, as they say, lost properties, that she's a figure now of a kind of nostalgia. That was the ideal social world, where all the children were together. There were 80 of us in the household. It was the household. These large household combinations, the married brothers, the sisters, the in-marrying men. And so that complex social relationship that house stood for is evoked now in the context of, well, we've all separated now, we're all separate now, we don't have the big house now. And as one very well-known lawyer in Java said to me of Arab descent, he said, I have the blueprints for our house in Pekalongan. Let me show you. I want to rebuild it. My sister and I want to rebuild it. And of course, that stood for an enormous number of different possibilities. And here is another thing that the Alcaffs did in Singapore, is they built a Japanese garden in the late 1920s and 1930s. And there are pagodas, Japanese bridges, the ornamental lake. The Japanese designer was very keen on dirt track motorbike racing, so he had a dirt track motorbike racing round it. 40 acres in central east Singapore when there was no other gardens. So this is a taking of space. This was the Alcaff gardens, and you can go back to Egypt. The Japanese garden, after all, had been a very important thing in the West, particularly in the later 19th century, Japanese and Chinese. So yes, we can. Well. And here are, if we can get them better into focus. Here are the young elite of the Alcaffs, and if we can see them. Two brothers here. He, Sayyid Muhammad, became the key figure in the administration of the estates, because one of the things that is interesting about Sayyid Sheikh, who founded this property empire, he returned with most of his sons and daughters to Hadramaut. And from Hadramaut, the sons, or as to my friend, the uncles, as it were, would send their instructions and their messages and their passing there of monies and property deeds and whatever else was being done to Sayyid Muhammad, the young Sayyid Muhammad, whose father had died, he was an orphan by this stage, who was their agent in Singapore. So in the network of the diaspora, which I'm sure is familiar to a lot of you in the room, the question is, who are the agents and interlocutors? And one of the things that was crucial for him was to have the Indian law clerk, to have the Chinese comprador, to know the English solicitor, so that he could operate not only the family wealth with instructions from Hadhramaut right through until the 1950s, but so that he could play a wider part in their financial position, because Alcaffs, who manages diaspora wealth? Right? How does it pass? How are all these remittances made? How are investments carried on from generation to generation? One of the things that happens is, of course, you appoint trustees and agents. And those trustees and agents are entitled to 3% or 5% of the rents. And one of the things the Alcaffs became, crucially, was the agents and trustees of, over time, thousands of Hadharim. Frequently people who didn't know they had any property because it's 3 generations down and all sorts of things that happened. But part of their family fortune was founded on the networks of tracking who was alive, who was dead, who had what right to which bit of what, under English law as well as under Muslim law. So the young man here, and notice the dress, it's Malay court dress. Some of the sayyids had the top button of the jacket open. It was said that a sayyid was the only one entitled in front of the sultan to have the top button open. They're wearing very beautiful sarong, sometimes in the Czech style, which is male, sometimes much more in the batik style. You can't see it, but some of them are wearing black patent leather court shoes with black silk socks, and so on. And there they are. I think we have another one, do we? The one with the camel? No, okay, we've lost the camel. But in one of the pictures, there was a large and extremely baffled camel who is tethered to a tree, because this is, after all, an Arab family in the Japanese garden. So you see what I mean by translation. Where is he? Yeah, there you go. Crucial. A crucial figure, the decor of social influence. They are at their ease. They have the wind-up gramophone. And very important in the picture is this figure. Because in official pictures, you always have a servant. That one figure is in the background, or perhaps he's the driver, the sais of the cars, which of course very few people have. And there he is under the pagoda, and there's the others, and so on and so forth. Yes, thank you. And just to, I think we're the wrong way around somehow. Can we turn it over? Yes, that's better. Just to finish this slides section, and perhaps I should leave much more time for conversation, because I've been moving around, of course, a lot. This is the palace, or one of the palaces, of Sayyid. He was knighted, Sir Abu Bakr bin Sheikh Alcaff, in the 1930s. The figure there, you can't see in this slide, is the Dutch consul in Jeddah, Van der Meulen, who was a student of the famous Snoek Hogronier, who was very interested in what the British were doing in Hadhramaut, because the Dutch were very interested in what the British were doing in Hadhramaut, and the British were very interested in what the Dutch were doing in Mecca and in Indonesia. And there he is in front of the ornamental pool, on the rugs, with Sayyid Abu Bakr bin Sheikh to his right. So a figure like Abu Bakr bin Sheikh was able to try to convert the family position into a social, political, local sets of relations across a period of something like 40 years or 50 years. But of course, those relations are marked by divisions, by conflicts. The brothers split into 3 sets of brothers. Of course, there's the classic one who spends all the money and wastes everything. There's the one who won't spend anything. So the family story becomes like a 19th century novel about property. It's the dynasty. It's almost Ibn Khaldun, the second generation, then what happens in the third, and then what. But the 19th century novels in English are full of the inevitable eruptions of conflict. I see some nodding heads in the audience around inheritance and around divisions of property and who gets what and who's entitled to what and who has fought for 30 years so that any of the money that all the properties were worth has long since been exhausted, but who is never going to give up the fight to prove that they had the right to such and such. So one of the things that happens with these trusts and settlements is, well, two things. On the one hand, they fuel, of course, the particular lifestyles of the Alcaffs and of these households and dependents and retainers and friends and attached persons. And in every Alcaff will, as I'm sure you all know, there is always provision for charitable endowment. There's always money being given to the poor. There's always money being given for the provision of wells and water supplies, mosques and women's prayer rooms and individual named persons. Everything is being named. The rubies, the diamonds, the pearls, the account books are handed on. The books are handed on. The properties are given this, and the other way. So these houses in Chinatown in Singapore pay for a tremendous underpinning to a lot of social relations, not just in Hadhrami, but across the Indian Ocean. So I think perhaps that at that point what I'll do is simply stop it to say that I brought it only, the story only in this rather general way, to the Second World War and the period just after it, which is the beginning of the decline of the fortunes of some of the families and some of the groupings, and that's also part of my study, and we can talk about it if you would like. But one of the interesting things to me is what are the transformations in the ways in which identifications are made about being Arab in Southeast Asia as a whole. Because if I were to try and bring it up to date, it's not about so much and only what happened in Hadhrami. There was a Marxist revolution, the British are thrown out. There's killing, there's displacement, there's different property regime. Then another property regime comes out. There are famines. There's a whole history through which one has to track these different persons. But in the contemporary period too, of course, the place of being Arab has changed a great. For example, in Indonesia, as I mentioned very early on in my talk, it was very common when I was there in 2000, for example, for Indonesian friends to say, male or female, to say, well, of course, I had to hide being Arab. And fortunately, I don't look Arab. But you should see my brother. He really looks Arab. Poor guy. Because when we were at school, he really used to get badly teased. But thank goodness I look Chinese, because my mother's Chinese, you see, and I inherited the skin and the straight hair. And I used to mercilessly tease a girl in my class who was of Arab origin, because I was so afraid people would discover I was of Arab origin. And now I feel so ashamed of myself. But in those days, and friends in their late 50s, early 60s who spoke Dutch in their education remembered the Dutch insulting songs on the playground that were sung about Arabs. And the idea of the Arabs, they're sort of mean and tough and hard and brutal and so on and so on and so on and so forth. Whereas the nationalists were saying, well, they haven't been with us. They haven't been with us nationalists. They're Arab. And they wouldn't accept Arab supporters until after the Second World War. So being Arab in Singapore, Malaysia, and Java have been extremely different range of circumstances and conditions, for men and for women. But in Indonesia, in the last 20 years, partly, but only partly in relation to certain kinds of religious changes, of certain of the Habibs who are preaching and establishing da'wah, which is preaching and teaching, but also the very lively youth debate among the youth and the universities and the schools and so on. You find a tremendous debate about being Arab and persons constructing themselves as Arab, playing only in Arab soccer teams, Arab football teams, changing their Javanese name to Ahmed, and then saying, well, I'm Ahmed bin Abdullah. The Javanese, the brother who doesn't change his name, hoots with mocking laughter and said, what is all this bin stuff? Because in Java you use one name. Or you shift Wito to Ahmed, or Ahmed to Wito. So in that kind of shifting universe of being Arab, there you can see just how fluid some of the translations are, and some of the political difficulties that they pose. And I think there is a new Arabism, so to speak, in Indonesia now, and to some degree in Malaysia, around which the idea of sayyid descent and links to Hadhrami have become symbolically and socially very important. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I am Sulaiman Khalaf, anthropologist, currently working at Adash. And I want first to thank Michael for this very interesting journey that took us from Hadramaut across many boundaries. I have known Michael for many, many years, since he worked in Lebanon on different kind of ethnography. But I'd like to ask you two questions, if I may. One relates to the ethnography part of your work. What impressed me most is the scale of your field work. It stretches across so many boundaries and many, many countries. How did you simply cope with such a multi-sited ethnographic work? Mm-hmm. What sort of challenges, what sort of strategies did you utilize to cope with it? Mm-hmm. And what sort of challenges that met you? And if there are any pleasures or delights that came in the way, we'd love to hear some of them. Because I think this sort of ethnographic work is fascinating, that deals with transnational diasporic communities. And your comments on that would be really appreciated.
Sure.
The second question relates to diasporic communities in general. And we know that there are many tribal groups in the world that have become transnational. Mm-hmm. And I use the term tribe in the anthropological sense. I'm thinking here of the Lebanese, the Jews, the Greeks, the Scots, and the Irish that have dispersed throughout the world. The question that I'd like you, if you can identify one or two features that single out the Hadhrami experience from this global tribes that have dispersed into the world over the last 2 centuries. Mm-hmm. Anything unique or particular to them? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, I'll try and answer briefly so that we can keep a conversation going. I suppose every ethnographer has the feeling that what they do is actually impossible, that it really can't be done. And certainly with this, it's enormously complicated. What have I actually done? I spent 6 months only in Java, and I've traveled in Malaysia and Penang and so on. But I've spent most of my time in Singapore. And one of the things that happened in Singapore, let me backtrack a little bit, was to say that I had an interest in families over time. I'm using the word family in a very general sense. It changes very radically, of course, what family is taken to be. And ideas about kinship and property, and relations particularly to kinship and property. And I was saying to myself in Java 10 years ago, well, if I'm interested in family histories and talking to people in Surabaya, which was an extraordinarily vibrant place to talk to Arab community people, still, and Singapore and Jakarta and so many other places, Kuala Lumpur. If I'm doing this, then I have to think about inheritance, don't I? Nobody writes about inheritance anymore. Completely vanished. So it's occurred to me as a kind of almost commonsensical thought that if you're looking at the reproduction of family over time, socially, symbolically, politically, economically, and so on, then you must deal with inheritance. But how would you deal with inheritance? People are not going to come in and give you wills and so on. But in Singapore, I went to see Sayyid Alcaffs, and I had already been looking at law reports, because I think this kind of ethnography becomes extremely documentary. One of my tribes is the documents. I'm an anthropologist among the documents. Very different kinds of documents have to be read in very different kinds of ways, and they're in very different languages. I mean, legal language, letters, different genres and so on. So it's become a very documentary kind of work. And I was with Sayyid Alwi in his office. All that's left of the Alcaff business is a little office, maybe 20 by 12 or something like that, where he has his own business, and a couple of nephews do sometimes some work and sometimes don't. And I said to him, as we were leaving, we had a very nice conversation. I was used to family histories, discussion of family histories, genealogical relations, my grandmother, and that kind of conversation. You should meet so-and-so, I'll pass you on to so-and-so. And I said to him, really, because I'd never had a positive answer to this question, I don't suppose you have any archives, do you? Family archives. And he said exactly what everybody in Jakarta or Surabaya had said to me. Oh no, we're businessmen, we don't care about that. I mean, papers, histories, past, I mean, well, nothing to do with anything. We don't, totally irrelevant, unfortunately. It's a shame, but there you are. So I said, oh, that's all right. And I was on my way out, and then he pointed to a row of cupboards along the wall and said, well, there's some stuff in there. And I suppose I had an awful premonition. It was like a child, the treasure chest or the monster, what's it going to be? And he opens these doors, and there are these English legal documents folded in thick, heavy paper with red silk ribbons bound around them, and files like this, the trust of this, the settlement of that, the will of this, the will of that, the will of that, which the Alcaffs had been administering. They had been administering other people's pasts and futures. They had been running their reproduction of those other families through the law courts, through the monies, through the travels, through the person who put it in his pocket and took it on trust, and so on, so on, so on. And I remember looking at this and thinking, as historian friends of mine often say, on the one hand, you think, oh, how wonderful, how amazing, how stunning. On the other hand, you think, oh, no. No. Now, what have I got myself into? And that's the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity, because he said, look, these young so-and-sos, meaning his nephews, they could care less about this stuff. So I then spent months doing what anthropologists often find themselves doing, something that was completely and totally incomprehensible to anybody to whom I spoke. Why would anybody waste their time with papers? So it's a very interesting, and yet these papers, and the interesting thing about these papers is they come back to life. They're dead, but they come back to life. I mean, Sayyid Abdullah, who dies in 26, leaves 3 wills. I won't go into all the details, but suffice it to say, these wills are apparently carried out and everything's hunky-dory and no problems at all for 30 years. 1958, suddenly there are documents flying from the Sharia court in Tarim to the Singapore English language, back to Tarim, back to another descendant of Sayyid Abdullah, back to this, back to that, through the High Court of Appeal in Singapore. And that goes on for another 25 years. About what? About the 3 wills of 1928 and how they didn't match with each other and they hadn't been properly administered. And so what happens with wills and inheritance in the modern and contemporary period under colonial is that families identify themselves through their legal relations. And it's the use of legal as in relation to claims about money, properties, shares, and rights, what is proper. Is it right and proper that I should have X or Y? So it's the language of gift, the language of right, the language of what my grandmother, my grandfather would give to me, and so on. And all of that is tangled up in these documents, which seem on the one hand to be dead, and which can somehow enter back into the legal process. And they are records of family divisions as well. I actually have a student, a research assistant, the other day, and she said to me, we haven't been working together very long, and she'd been looking at a lot of these documents with me. And she was clearly embarrassed about something, and a very intelligent historian. And she said, well, could I ask you something? And I said, of course. She said, well, it's just that we're reading all these documents. And I said, that's right, yeah. But you're an anthropologist, right? So you're not a historian, but you're reading documents, and I don't know why. So it's just a very sophisticated PhD student. I said, well, anthropology, history, anthropology, you know, there are moves between. But you have to imagine all these documents in Arabic, in Malay, written in the Jawi script, as it used to be called, and in English. And when people were communicating with each other about family fortunes and inheritances, they were moving between three languages. Some knew the three, some did not. Some were having to think in Arabic about what the English would have to come to look like to be valid in an English court. So you get people saying, if you bilad Nasara, then if this doesn't work, we ought to have that. And you can feel them grappling with the formal Arabic, the sort of raised register of Arabic, of a will, trying to think about its mutations through double translations with specialist legal vocabulary. And of course, wills mean totally different things. Sayyid Sheikh's will has a page and a half about the ideal Muslim death. And when I come towards death, then this will happen, I will be placed this way, I will be turned that way, these people will gather, people will be around, the person's charged to do this will do that, verses of the Quran will be spoken, then, and it sketches over a page and a half the proper death of the great Sheikh Alcaff. And then what will happen after that proper death. So none of that gets into, quote, the English will. But for a will on Singapore property to be valid, and this is where he had his wealth, it had to be proved in an English court, not in a Muslim court. It had to be proved in an English court because the Mufti had no authority over real estate in Singapore. So landed property, houses, rents, and so on, gold and diamonds and rubies and books and things, that's another matter, personal wealth. So it's very complicated.
Thank you, Professor Michael. That was a very interesting presentation you had. I actually had two questions. One relating to the diaspora. You characterized the settling of some of the Hadhrami families in Singapore and Malaysia and so forth as a diaspora. And you also mentioned that there was a second wave of migration in the latter period, even though there was earlier migrations than that. So maybe from an anthropological perspective, when do we stop characterizing a settled group as a diaspora, and when does it become actually part of the indigenized group in that country?
Yeah, sure.
The second question might be somewhat unrelated to your presentation, but I read from your background that you've also had studies into Egypt and Lebanon as well. So you might be aware of, you know, the practice of Islam, especially in those countries. And you mentioned today the popular narrative of the 9 saints in Indonesia. And it's generally acknowledged, especially in Muslim circles, that, let's say, the brand of Islam or the type of Islam that's practiced in areas where Hadramis settled and brought their da'wah, so to speak, like in the coastal areas of India and the Malay archipelago, obviously, as well as East Africa, which you also find many of the same Saqaf and Jamal al-Layl families as well. In your estimation as an anthropologist, and this sort of practice of Islam has been remarkably for the most part, resistant to extremist narratives within their practice. From what you've seen of the Hadhrami way of settling and migration and the way the families have been established and so forth, what do you think might be some of those factors that can describe this phenomenon?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, all the terminologies about migration, of course, migrants, as I say, settlers, people who settled, sojourners, people who travel, all that is an attempt to grapple with a very complicated story over time. And settlement, as I mentioned, for Chinese communities from Southeast China really begins actually in the later 19th century, and then you've got the whole notion of the overseas Chinese, which is colored also by the idea of the relation back to the lineage temple. Because what Chinese do, and this is obviously one of the crucial things, is there a notion of homeland or ancestral land? Or is it crucial that ancestral links should be honored in ritual, religious, economic, social, whatever ways, translated back in China, not least by moving back, or not? So this is a very familiar history to people. And when is a settler a settler? If a person happens to die in Kalimantan, we don't know what he or she might or might not have decided to do, and what notion of return plays a part in family stories and histories, or played a part, because it's difficult to reconstruct motivations. But it's interesting that Sayyid Sheikh at around the 1900-1910 period, he goes back and nearly all the children stay in Hadramaut. Nearly all of them. They live in these large palaces and so on. They make visits. They construct that extraordinary Hadhrami architecture, which you've no doubt seen pictures of, which is sort of Indo-Javo, Malayo, Zanzibari, in every color that you can, and transform the landscape in those terms. So I think the issue of homeland would be one crucial question. And of course, that issue has been immensely complicated in modern times by the British occupation, the revolution against the British, the revolution, so to speak, against the revolution 30 years later. So there have been these massive transformations of relations to anywhere that might be taken to be homeland. And now I think it's fair to say that there's a construction of an idealized Hadramaut in contemporary, let's say, Java, which is sort of partly made by videos. You go on trips and tours and tourist groups, or you could, when you could do that. And you have videos, and particularly if you are a sayyid, of course, there's the new cult of the genealogy, which is on the walls. And if you're being Arab in Jakarta now, you might, for example, have your large sitting room with your elegant furniture, but one corner of it has the photographs of the bearded ancestors on the wall. It has the genealogies on the wall. It has some other major portraits of Habaib on the wall. There are cushions on the floor. Mint tea is served. If people are going to eat, one of the interesting problems, sorry, I'm digressing, but it's difficult not to. One of the interesting problems in Jakarta or Singapore is, what do you do on public occasions to have an Arab wedding? And this is a real problem. Because what is an Arab wedding? Yes, you could have strict gender segregation. You could have the men wearing the white cap. That's Arab for some people. But do you do a Yemeni dance, the zafan? Well, in the Four Seasons, or whichever the hotel was, when friends of mine's son married the fourth daughter of the chief minister of Sarawak, when they got married in Sarawak, they had 4 days. She's not of an Arab origin. 4 days of celebrations culminating in the 15,000 people football pitch, right? Stadium. In Singapore, my friends really weren't going to be able to do that, and they've been symbolically crushed by this, because the families were completely disparate social standing in that sense. But he was a sayyid. And so what they did was to have, and in Sarawak there had been 4 different ways of dressing on each of the 4 nights. Local dress, traditional dress, modern dress, and come as you like, I think. I can't remember exactly. Malay or something like this, right? So everybody's switching all the time, right? But what do you do to be Arab and being Sayyid in the 4 seasons or whatever it is? You had Arab dances, this was subject of great, and you served nasi kabuli, which is mutton with rice. And nasi kabuli has become the Arab dish in Singapore. And if you say to Arabs in Singapore, what's your dish? They say, oh, biryani. We're the specialists in biryani. We found a new place on Racecourse Road. Must go there because of it. So there's a lot of movement like that. Nobody's going to go back to Hadramaut. But they are going to have property connections, probably still, through and around Hadramaut. But it's difficult not to think that Java and Singapore, Hadramaut is a very small, uncertain political place, and look at the hygiene, and where is the toilets, and what about, so there's a very ambiguous, uneasy language about this. And I think now, 5 generations, 4 generations, 6 generations, we're Indonesians of Arab descent. It doesn't make sense. Why diaspora, it wouldn't make any sense to us. Unless you're saying in the 19th century, then perhaps it makes sense. In terms of the Habaib, well, it's both. There was a period in the 2001, 2003, when some of the more quote-unquote extremist groups, the young ones, and Sabili and journals like that, were identified with these young Hadhrami. And there was a lot of criticism, a lot of unease among the older members of the community. They were linked with Indonesian nationalists like General Wiranto, who was a military chief who had been responsible for massacres in Timor and so on and so forth. So they were playing all sorts of, on the campuses and with other Habaib, of course, there was a very different language going on. And it was around the pilgrimage, the ziyarah to the tombs, the teaching, the evening of light in the southern suburbs of Jakarta, which I'm sure you know about, in which the non-political is essential, and that Islam is light, and there's a tremendous emphasis, as I'm sure you know, theologically and symbolically on Sayyids and the Sayyid link, of course, to Prophet Muhammad and through Fatima, with that idea of light and the purity, and with song, singing with hymns, with sort of public performances of this universe, which takes over the streets. And is one directed in one way partly to its critics. Who are these Habaib? Why do we care? There is no privilege in Islam for dissent. That very agitated language which is still there. And of course, most of the followers are not necessarily have any connection to Arabs at all, but will say he is of Arab descent. He is Sayyid. So it's a very ambiguous position, I think, sometimes, Sayyid. It can be extremely privileged or quite the opposite. And you can get all sorts of mixed stories about that. But I think there's a new wave, I'm sure you know them better than I do, of younger generation, Habaib, some of whom have sort of a major public position. And they associate with political parties in overt or not so overt ways sometimes. So that's a very variable story. And some of them are deeply anti-jihadist, and because, of course, these things have been fought out in, as you know, through his name, I forget, the Bashir, the preacher who ran the Pesantren, where so it's been very acutely tense, because suddenly this is a phenomenon in which the intelligence services, the Americans, the this, the that, and the other, all gathered around, terror, Qaeda, and so on. So it's as I'm sure you know, it's an enormously complicated story.
I think in this there's a pressing question. We should take the conversation into the reception. I just wanted to say that in the first title that Michael sent us and sent me to announcing what he was going to speak about, he used the word, and I'd suggested that no one would know that that's mutton biryani. Well, I didn't. Perhaps I was wrong. I hope I'm wrong. No, you know anyway. So we should go and eat some nasi kabuli next door, or at least pretend what we're eating is nasi kabuli. Please join me in thanking Michael for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you very much.